The sound wasn't a scream, it was the groan of structural failure, the high pitched shriek of metal being forced to occupy the same space as stone. I remember the smell first, the sharp ozone bite of an airbag deploying, followed immediately by the cloying metallic scent of my own blood cooling against the upholstery. There was a moment, a singular, crystalline second of suspension, where the world tilted on its axis and I felt my bones become something other than support. They became shrapnel. I felt the snap in my left femur like a dry branch under a boot, a dull, sickening thud that vibrated through my teeth. Then came the silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but a heavy, pressurized weight that pressed against my eardrums, the kind of silence that only exists in the wake of a catastrophe. They thought that was the end of me. They watched the car tumble, watched the shadows swallow the wreckage at the bottom of the ravine, and they walked away, certain that the woman they knew was pulverized into the dirt. 3 years later, the silence is different. It's clinical. It's the silence of this seaside cottage, a place where the air is thick with the smell of salt and the medicinal tang of the liniment I rub into my thighs every morning. I sit here now, looking out at the gray Atlantic, and I listen to the rhythm of my own breath. It is the only metronome I have left. In the beginning, my breath was a jagged thing, a series of panicked hitches that made my fractured ribs grate against one another like tectonic plates. Now it is deep, it is deliberate. I have spent 1,095 days teaching my lungs how to expand without flinching, teaching my heart that it doesn't need to race every time the wind rattles the window pane. My recovery has not been a graceful ascent. It has been a brutal, ugly crawl through the mud of my own limitations. I remember the first time they sat me up in the hospital, the way the world dissolved into a smear of nauseating white light as my blood pressure plummeted. My body had forgotten how to be upright. I was a collection of pins, plates, and surgical mesh, a Frankenstein's monster of modern orthopedics. They told me I might walk with a frame. They told me I would likely never regain full range of motion in my right shoulder, which had been pulverized when the door caved in. But they, the doctors, the therapists, the well meaning nurses, didn't know about the fire that had been lit in the wreckage. They didn't understand that the more they spoke of my limitations, the more I began to build a fortress inside my mind. Isolation was my first tool. I chose this cottage because the nearest neighbor is 2 miles of dunes away. I didn't want eyes on me. I didn't want the pitying looks of people who remembered me as the woman I was before, the woman who commanded boardrooms and moved through the world with a terrifying, fluid grace. I needed to be alone with the phantom weight of what I lost. There is a specific kind of mourning one does for their own physicality. I miss the way my ankles used to feel in 4-inch heels. Now they are thick, scarred, and perpetually swollen, happiest only when encased in heavy-soled hiking boots that provide the stability my tendons no longer can. I miss the lack of awareness of my own frame. Now I am aware of every joint, every ligament, every centimeter of skin that has been grafted and stitched. Every morning starts the same. I wake before the sun, the cold air from the ocean seeping through the floorboards. The pain is always there, a low, thrumming bass note that tells me I'm still alive. I don't reach for the pills anymore. Instead, I reach for the edge of the bed and I sit. I wait for the dizziness to pass. I focus on the sensation of the rough wool rug beneath my feet. I have to tell my toes to move. It's a conscious command, a telegram sent from my brain to a distant, war-torn province. Flex, release, flex, release. Then comes the walk to the kitchen. It's only 20 paces, but in the first year, those 20 paces were my Everest. I would count them out loud, my voice rasping in the empty house. 1, 2, breathe, 3. I can still feel the ghost of the walker, the cold aluminum under my palms, the way my arms would shake with the effort of unweighting my shattered pelvis. Now I walk unaided, though I favor the right side, a subtle hitch in my giddy up that I've learned to embrace. It is the cadence of a survivor. I spend hours on the deck, even when the spray from the waves is so cold it feels like needles against my face. I have a set of resistance bands anchored to the railing. I pull against them until my muscles scream, until the sweat drips off my chin and freezes in the wind. I am rebuilding the muscle they tried to strip away. I am thickening the walls of my own heart. I think of them often, the ones who orchestrated the accident, the ones who think I am a closed chapter in a dusty book. I think of their faces, clear and sharp in my mind, and I use that image as a whetstone. Every lunge, every agonizing stretch of my hamstrings is a sharpening of the blade. They thought I'd never recover because they viewed recovery as a return to the person I was. They didn't realize I was building something new. The woman who went over that cliff died in the ravine. She was soft in ways she didn't know, vulnerable to the betrayals of people she trusted. The woman in this cottage is made of different stuff. I am forged from the titanium in my shins and the cold, hard resolve that comes from being left for dead. I look at my hands. They are older now, the skin thinner, the knuckles larger. I see the faint, white lines of scars that map out the trauma, a geography of survival. I pick up a smooth stone from the beach when I carried up during my afternoon trek, a trek that now spans 3 miles of coastline. I squeeze it. My grip is firm. My pulse is steady. The phantom weight of the broken woman is still there, hovering like a shadow, but it no longer drags me down. It is a reminder of the depth of the hole I climbed out of. I am no longer just surviving the isolation, I am mastering it. I am the architect of this clinical silence, and soon, very soon, I will be ready to break it. The world thinks I am a memory, a tragic footnote. They have no idea that the most dangerous thing you can do is leave a woman like me with nothing but time, pain, and a reason to get back up. The rhythm of my breath is no longer a struggle, it is a countdown. The transition from the physical to the cerebral was not a leap, but a slow, agonizing crawl, much like my first attempts to move from the hospital bed to the vinyl chair 3 feet away. For months, my world had been the circumference of my own skin, the heat of inflammation, the sharp bite of a surgical staple, the dull, rhythmic ache of bones knitting themselves back together in ways that felt alien to my original design. But as the strength returned to my limbs, as the 3 mile treks along the shoreline became a matter of discipline rather than a miracle, the focus shifted. I could no longer spend every waking hour contemplating the architecture of my hip or the elasticity of my scarred lungs. I had to look outward. I had to look back at the world that had discarded me like a broken toy. The laptop screen is a harsh blue rectangle against the amber glow of the hearth. It feels like a foreign object in this cottage of wood and salt, a cold conduit to a life that seems like a fevered dream. When I first opened it, my fingers hesitated over the keys. My hands, once so certain as they flew across a keyboard or gestured with authority during a quarterly review, felt clumsy. The nerve damage in my left ring finger causes it to twitch occasionally, a tiny, rebellious tremor that I've learned to ignore. I logged in using a series of encrypted tunnels I'd set up years ago as a contingency, a black box for a rainy day. I never imagined that rainy day would involve a literal deluge and a plunge into a ravine. The first thing I did was look at the stock prices. It was a masochistic impulse, I suppose. I wanted to see how the empire fared without its architect. Marcus's face stared back at me from a digital clipping on a financial news site. He looked well, better than well, he looked triumphant. He was wearing a suit I recognized, a bespoke charcoal three-piece ID once complimented him on during a trip to London. He'd leaned into the role of the visionary savior, the man who stepped in when the unfortunate tragedy of my accident left a vacuum at the top. The article described him as dynamic and stabilizing. It mentioned me only in the final paragraph, a brief, sterile sentence about my ongoing private recovery and my legacy of foundational growth. They spoke of me in the past tense, a ghost whose name was still useful for branding but whose presence was no longer required. I leaned back, the wood of the chair pressing into the sensitive area of my lower back where the most significant graft had been placed. I closed my eyes and let the memory of that board meeting wash over me again, no longer as a trauma to be survived, but as a data set to be analyzed. I remembered the smell of the room, expensive espresso, and the faint, metallic scent of the air conditioning. I remembered the way Marcus didn't look at me when he presented the restructuring plan. He looked at the wall behind me, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that spoke of efficiency and new directions. But it was Sarah who truly haunted the periphery of that memory. Sarah, whom I had plucked from a mid-level management role and mentored for 6 years. I had taught her how to read a balance sheet for the lies hidden in the margins. I had shown her how to hold a room's attention by lowering her voice instead of raising it. During that meeting, she had kept her eyes firmly planted on a microscopic scratch in the mahogany table. She didn't vote against me. She didn't even abstain. She raised her hand with the rest of them, a silent, obedient soldier in Marcus's coup. When the meeting adjourned and I was escorted out not by security, which would have been too dramatic for their tastes, but by a polite HR representative who spoke in whispers, Sarah had been the only one who didn't look up. The accident happened 3 hours later. The rain was a solid wall of gray, the kind of weather that makes the world feel small and claustrophobic. I remember the headlights in my rearview mirror. They were too high, too bright. They didn't feel like a car following me. They felt like a predator tracking its prey. I remember the sudden, violent jolt as my bumper was clipped, not a hard hit, but a precise one designed to send a speeding car into a hydroplane. The steering wheel became a live wire in my hands, bucking and kicking as I fought for control. Then the sickening weightlessness as the tires left the asphalt. The world turned upside down, a kaleidoscope of shattering glass and the scream of twisting metal. They thought I died. They had to. No one survives a fall like that, not in a vehicle that looked like a crushed soda can at the bottom of a ravine. I remember the cold water of the creek seeping into the cabin, the smell of gasoline and mud. I remember the silence that followed the crash, a silence so profound it felt like the world had ended. I lay there for hours, my body a map of agony, watching the moon move across the small patch of sky visible through the broken sunroof. I didn't feel like a CEO then. I didn't feel like a woman of influence. I felt like an animal, primal and singular, focused entirely on the next breath. Now in the cottage, I tap a rhythm on the desk with my good hand. The recovery of my assets has been a slow, quiet process. I had accounts they didn't know about, safety nets woven into the fabric of my life long before Marcus ever thought to sharpen his knife. I have been moving money, small amounts at first, through a series of shells that lead back to a woman who doesn't exist on any corporate registry. I am no longer interested in the foundational growth of the company I built. I am interested in its demolition. I get up and walk to the window, watching the tide come in. The hitch in my stride is more pronounced when I've been sitting too long, a reminder that I am no longer a creature of the boardroom. I am something more rugged now, more durable. I look at my reflection in the dark glass. The woman looking back has a streak of white at her temple that wasn't there before. Her eyes are harder, the softness of corporate diplomacy stripped away to reveal the flint beneath. I think about the accident again. I've spent months dissecting it. Who was driving the car? Marcus wouldn't have done it himself. He's too fond of his own manicured hands. He would have hired someone, a ghost who knows how to make a murder look like a misfortune. But Sarah would have known my route. She knew I always took the back roads when I was upset, that I sought the solitude of the trees when my mind was racing. She would have known exactly where the guardrail ended and the drop began. The betrayal is a cold coal in my chest, one I keep burning. It provides the warmth that the Atlantic wind tries to steal. They think I am a memory, a tragic footnote in the history of a successful firm. They are currently planning the annual gala, a glittering event where they will likely announce a scholarship in my name, a final, insulting bit of theater to cement their grief. I reach out and touch the glass, my fingertips cold. I am not a ghost. I am the architect of a new reality. I have spent a year learning how to walk, how to breathe, and how to endure. Now I am going to spend the next year teaching them the meaning of the word consequence. The countdown isn't just for my return, it's for their reckoning. Every day I get stronger, every day my digital footprint grows more complex, and every day the distance between this cottage and that mahogany table shrinks. They didn't just leave me for dead, they left me with nothing to lose. And a woman with nothing to lose is the only thing Marcus and Sarah should truly fear. I turn back to the laptop, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, and I begin to type the first of many anonymous tips to the federal regulators. The demolition has officially begun. The click of the mouse was a small sound, barely audible over the rhythmic thrum of the Atlantic against the jagged rocks below the cottage, yet it felt like the firing of a starting pistol. The file I sent wasn't a manifesto or a dramatic confession. It was a dry 30-page spreadsheet detailing the offshore shell companies Marcus had used to hide the discretionary funds he'd been siphoning for years. I didn't send it to the police. They are too easily bought in a city like ours. I sent it to a specific mid-level auditor at the SEC, a man named Henderson whom I'd researched for weeks. Henderson was a man of middling ambition but immense, stubborn integrity, the kind of man who would see a discrepancy like a personal insult and wouldn't stop pulling the thread until the entire tapestry unraveled. As the upload complete bar vanished, I felt a strange, cold lightness in my chest. For months, I had been a ghost, a woman of shadows and silence, but with that single action, I had become a participant in the world again. I leaned back in the creaky wooden chair, my spine protesting the movement. My body is a ledger of that night on the mountain road. My left hip aches when the dampness rolls in off the ocean, and my right hand, the one that gripped the steering wheel until the knuckles nearly burst through the skin, still has a slight tremor when I'm tired. I looked down at it, watching the fingers twitch against the dark wood of the desk. I closed my eyes and forced the tremor to stop, a mental exercise I practiced for hours every day. Control is not something you have, it is something you maintain second by grueling second. Living under the name Clara has been a lesson in the art of the mundane. In my previous life, I was defined by the sharpness of my suits, the height of my heels, and the absolute authority of my voice in a room filled with men who wanted to be me or destroy me. Now I am the woman who buys day-old bread at the local bakery because it's cheaper and who spends her afternoons sitting on a weathered bench by the pier, staring at the horizon. The locals think I'm a widow from the city, someone who lost her husband and her spirit in one fell swoop. I let them think it. Their pity is a shield, a thick layer of social insulation that keeps them from looking too closely at the scars on my neck or the way my eyes never actually relax, even when I'm smiling. Every morning, before the sun has fully cleared the waterline, I perform my ritual of recovery. It is a slow, agonizing process that would have broken the woman I was 2 years ago. I start with the resistance bands tethered to the heavy iron bed frame. I pull until my muscles scream, until the sweat drips off my chin and onto the floorboards. I do it not just for strength, but for the reminder that I can still feel. The pain is grounded, it is real. It is the only thing they couldn't take from me. After the bands, I walk. I started a year ago by just making it to the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive. Now I trek 3 miles down the coast, navigating the uneven terrain of the dunes. The hitch in my stride, as I've come to call it, is a permanent guest in my body. It's a rhythmic limp that forces me to be deliberate with every step. I can no longer rush. I can no longer be impulsive. The accident stripped away my speed, but it gave me something far more dangerous, a terrifying glacial patience. When I return to the cottage, I return to the screens. I have 3 of them now, tucked away in a corner of the bedroom that I've converted into a makeshift command center. I spend hours watching them, Marcus and Sarah. They are so predictable in their victory. I watch the live streams of industry galas, zooming in until their faces fill the monitors. Marcus looks older, though he tries to hide it with expensive haircuts and a tan that looks like it came from a bottle. He carries himself with a frantic sort of energy now, the kind a man has when he knows he's standing on a pedestal made of glass. And Sarah has stepped into my old role with a hunger that is almost painful to witness. I saw a photo of her recently at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. She was wearing a pair of emerald earrings that I had left in my office safe the day of the crash. Seeing them on her didn't make me angry, it made me cold. It confirmed that she didn't just want my job, she wanted to inhabit my skin. She wanted to erase me and replace me piece by piece. They think they have one because the stock price is up and the board of directors is quiet. They don't realize that I am the one who kept that company from tilting into the abyss for a decade. Marcus is a salesman, not a strategist. He can charm a room, but he can't manage a crisis, and Sarah is too blinded by her own ambition to see the structural rot he's creating. By leaking that first document, I haven't just exposed a crime, I've planted a seed of paranoia. Marcus will know the leak came from the inside. He will look at his lieutenants, his secretaries, and even Sarah, and he will wonder who turned. He will start to question the loyalty of everyone around him, and in his desperation to find the traitor, he will make mistakes. He will overreach. He will try to cover his tracks, and in doing so, he will leave a trail of breadcrumbs that even a blind man could follow. I stood up from the desk, my joints popping in the quiet room. I walked to the small kitchenette and put the kettle on. The simplicity of my life here is a stark contrast to the opulence I once took for granted. I drink tea out of a chipped ceramic mug. I wear thick wool sweaters that smell of wood smoke. I have become a creature of the elements, hardened by the wind and the salt. I am no longer the woman who was pushed off that road. That woman died in the ravine, buried under the weight of her own naivety. The woman who climbed out of the wreckage is something else entirely. I am a predator who has learned the value of the long game. I have turned my grief into a map, and every day I mark a new path toward their undoing. The kettle began to whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the ocean. I poured the water, watching the steam rise and coat the window pane. Outside, the sky was turning a bruised purple, the first hint of a storm rolling in from the north. I welcomed it. The storms here are violent and honest. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. As I took a sip of the bitter tea, I looked back at the glowing screens. The demolition is a slow process, a series of controlled explosions designed to bring the structure down without damaging the surrounding buildings. I don't want to destroy the company, I built it after all. I only want to destroy the 2 people who think they own it. I want them to lose everything, their reputations, their freedom, and the easy sleep of the innocent. They thought I'd never recover, but they didn't realize that recovery isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about becoming the person who can take it all back and then some. I set the mug down and sat back at the computer. There was a second file ready to be sent, and the night was still young. The second file didn't just contain numbers, it contained the architecture of a lie. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, a thin blue line of digital retribution, and when it finally reached 100%, I felt a strange humming stillness in my chest. The sent notification flickered and vanished. Somewhere in the city, an anonymous inbox belonging to a federal investigator would soon ping, and Marcus's carefully constructed world would develop its first hairline fracture. But I couldn't stay in this cottage forever, watching the world through a glass screen. To finish this, I had to step back into the light. I had to become someone they would never suspect, someone who could walk right past them in a crowded room and leave nothing but the scent of expensive perfume and the faint, unsettling feeling of a ghost passing by. The metamorphosis began with the face. The surgeons I had found in Switzerland, men who operated with the cold precision of watchmakers, hadn't just repaired the damage, they had reinvented me. I remember the weeks after the final procedure, sitting in a darkened room with my head wrapped in layers of heavy gauze. The smell of antiseptic and my own stale breath was my only company. Every pulse of my heart felt like a hammer blow against my jaw, a rhythmic reminder that I was being rebuilt. When the bandages finally came off, I didn't cry. I looked at the stranger in the mirror with a clinical detachment. My cheekbones were higher now, the result of subtle implants that tightened the skin and gave my face a sharper, more aristocratic edge. My nose, once slightly rounded at the tip, was now a straight, narrow line. Even the set of my eyes seemed different, hooded by the lingering swelling in a way that made me look perpetually bored or perhaps merely dangerous. I was no longer the woman with the soft, approachable features who had shared a bed with Marcus. I was a sculpture of glass and steel. To complete the illusion, I let a stylist in Zurich take my hair, once a warm chestnut brown, and transform it into a shade of ash blonde so pale it was almost silver. It was a cold color, the color of moonlight on a frozen lake. It drained the warmth from my complexion, making my eyes pop with an icy, startling clarity. I looked at myself and saw a woman who had never known a day of struggle in her life, a woman born into old money and older secrets. But the face was only the beginning. The way I moved had to change. The accident had left my left leg shorter by a fraction of an inch, a permanent souvenir of the moment the guardrail gave way. In the early months, I had limped with a heavy, dragging sound that filled me with shame. Now I turned that limp into a signature. I spent hours in front of floor-to-ceiling mirrors, wearing 4-inch stilettos that cost more than my first car. I practiced a new gait, a slow, rhythmic movement that required me to pivot my weight in a way that disguised the hitch in my stride. I didn't walk, I glided. The slight pause in my step became a deliberate choice, a mark of sophistication rather than a disability. It suggested a woman who was never in a hurry because she knew the world would wait for her. It was a weaponized elegance, a way of moving that commanded the space around me. I chose the name Elena Vance. Sounded solid, established, and entirely new. Elena wasn't a victim, she was a predator in a silk suit. I began to build her history with the same meticulous care I used to build my company's quarterly reports. I funneled the remains of my offshore accounts, funds Marcus and Sarah had missed in their haste to strip my life bare, into a series of shell companies based in the Caymans and Luxembourg. I created a paper trail that suggested a decade of high-stakes venture capital work in Europe. Elena Vance was a woman who specialized in distressed assets, a fitting irony that I savored every time I looked at the forged documents. I was a vulture, and I was coming home to feed on the carcass of my own past. The wardrobe was the final layer of armor. I moved from the wool sweaters of the cottage to the boutiques of Milan and Paris. I bought suits made of silk and heavy wool, cut so precisely they felt like a second skin. They were structured with sharp shoulders and nipped waists that hid the puckered, angry scars that still crisscrossed my torso and thighs. Underneath the $5,000 blazers, my body was a map of trauma, skin grafts that felt tight when I breathed, deep indentations where the metal had pressed into my bone. But the silk hid all of it. When I dressed, I felt like a night dawning plate mail. The jewelry was minimal but aggressive. A heavy gold watch, a single diamond ring that looked like a shard of ice. I wanted to look like the kind of woman who could buy a company over breakfast and dismantle it by lunch. I practiced my voice too. My old voice had been melodic, prone to laughter. Elena's voice was lower, a controlled alto that rarely rose in volume. I learned to speak from my throat, keeping my tone flat and unreadable. I practiced my new signature until the muscle memory of my old name was erased, the loops and crosses of Elena Vance becoming sharp and jagged on the page. Standing in the cottage one last time, I looked at the woman I used to be in the old, grainy photos I'd kept for research. She looked so small, so eager to please. She looked like someone who believed that if you worked hard and played by the rules, the world would be kind to you. I felt a pang of pity for her, but no regret. She had to die so that I could survive. I took a match and lit the corner of the last photograph, watching the flames lick at the image of Marcus and me on our wedding day. I watched the fire consume my old face, the white lace of my dress turning to black ash in the sink. I packed my laptop, my burner phones, and my new life into a set of handmade leather suitcases. As I walked out to the car I had rented, a black SUV with tinted windows that felt like a rolling fortress, the wind caught my silver hair, whipping it across my face. I didn't flinch. I climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror, and looked at Elena Vance. Her eyes were cold, her mouth a thin, hard line. She was ready. The drive back toward the city felt like a descent into a battlefield. Every mile I covered brought me closer to the center of the rot. I wasn't just going back to reclaim a company, I was going back to haunt the people who thought they had buried me. They thought I was a memory, a tragic footnote in their success story. They didn't realize that I was the ghost in the machine, the glitch that was about to bring their entire world crashing down. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, the rhythm steady and calm. I had all the time in the world. I had the patience of a glacier and the cold, unyielding strength of the ice that remains long after the storm has passed. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, sickly yellow light over the skyline. It was a new day, and Elena Vance was finally home. The city didn't welcome me back, it merely tolerated my presence, a sprawling labyrinth of glass and steel teeth that looked exactly as I had left it, yet felt entirely alien. As I drove the SUV through the familiar grid of Manhattan, the neon lights of Times Square bled across my windshield like an open wound. I checked into a penthouse suite at a hotel where the staff was trained to be invisible under the name Elena Vance. I spent 3 days in that room, watching the city move below me, a silent observer charting the patterns of my prey. I didn't order room service. I didn't call anyone. I simply sat by the floor to ceiling window and breathed in the filtered air, letting the hum of the traffic settle into my bones until I felt as cold and uncompromising as the architecture. The gala was being held at the pier, a bastion of old money opulence that my former firm, now rebranded as Thorn Blackwood, used to signal their arrival into the upper echelons of the financial elite. It was a victory lap, a celebration of a record breaking fiscal year, wealth built on the foundation of my disappearance. I spent 4 hours preparing. I didn't just put on a dress, I constructed a persona. The charcoal silk of the gown was heavy, the fabric cool against the jagged ridges of the scars on my back. When the stylist zipped me into it, I felt the familiar constriction of the corset like bodice, a physical reminder of the boundaries I had set for myself. My silver hair was swept up into a severe architectural chignon, revealing the sharp line of my jaw and the stillness in my eyes. I looked into the mirror and saw a woman who had never known a moment of weakness. I saw a stranger. Stepping out of the car at the pier, the sensory assault was immediate. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi were rhythmic, blinding pulses of white light that felt like small explosions against my retinas. The air was thick with the scent of expensive desperation, a cloying mixture of oud wood, Chanel No. 5, and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. It was a smell I knew intimately. It was the scent of the world that had discarded me. I walked up the red carpet with a measured, predatory grace, my heels clicking against the marble with a sound like a ticking clock. I didn't smile for the cameras. Alina Vance didn't need the validation of a lens. Inside, the ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal. The heat from 500 bodies pressed against me, a suffocating warmth that made the skin grafts on my ribs itch with a phantom fire. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, refusing the alcohol that everyone else was using to grease the wheels of their social interactions. I needed to be sharp. I needed to be a razor. I moved through the crowd, a ghost in a sea of living ghosts, watching the way they preened and postured. There across the room, I saw Marcus. He looked older, his face more lined, but he carried himself with the bloated arrogance of a man who believed he had won. Beside him was Sarah, draped in emerald silk, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass. They were the center of the orbit, the sun and moon of this manufactured universe. I felt a surge of something dark and cold in my chest, but I didn't let it reach my face. My time with them would come later. Tonight was about the foundation. I turned my attention to the bar, where Julian Thorne was currently drowning his nerves in a double scotch. Julian had always been the weakest link in their chain, a man of middling talent and a massive inferiority complex who had been promoted far beyond his capabilities because he was loyal to Marcus. He was the one who had handled the redundant accounts during the transition, the one whose signature was on the documents that stripped my name from the company's charter. He was also a man who couldn't hide a secret to save his life. He carried his guilt like a physical weight, slumped shoulders, and a nervous habit of tugging at his French cuffs. I glided toward him, navigating the crush of bodies until I was standing just a few feet away. I waited for the moment he looked up from his glass, his eyes bloodshot and wandering. When our gazes finally met, I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I gave him the full weight of Alina Vance's scrutiny. Julian froze. He didn't recognize me. How could he? The woman he knew had chestnut hair and a soft, approachable face. This woman was a silver-haired specter of high finance ice, but there was something in my eyes, a resonance of the past that made the color drain from his cheeks. He blinked, shaking his head slightly as if trying to clear a fog. "Forgive me," I said, my voice low and resonant, the controlled alto I had practiced for months. I stepped closer, moving into his personal space, forcing him to acknowledge my presence. "You look like a man who has seen a ghost, Mr. Thorne." Julian's hand drifted to his tie, tightening it. "Do I? It's just the lights, a bit overwhelming tonight. And you are?" "Alina Vance," I said, extending a hand. My grip was firm, almost punishingly so. I'm with the Vance Group out of Luxembourg. We've been watching your firm's performance this quarter with great interest. Julian's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the Vance Group. I had spent 6 months and several $1 million ensuring that the name carried weight in the right circles. Vance, of course, I believe I saw your name on the guest list. A pleasure, Ms. Vance. I didn't realize you were in the city. I arrived recently, I said, my gaze never wavering from his. I could see the sweat beads forming at his hairline, the way his pulse throbbed in his neck. He was terrified, and he didn't even know why. I find that New York has a way of drawing people back, wouldn't you agree? Especially when there is unfinished business to attend to. Julian laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. Business is never finished in this town. That's the beauty of it, I suppose. Or the tragedy, I countered. I tilted my head, studying him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. I was looking over your recent acquisitions, Julian, very aggressive, very bold. It must have taken a great deal of courage to restructure the firm so completely after the, shall we say, unfortunate departure of your previous partner. The glass in Julian's hand trembled. The unfortunate departure was the official narrative of my death, a tragic accident that had left the company in the capable hands of those I trusted. To hear it mentioned by a stranger with such clinical detachment clearly unnerved him. Yes, well, we do what we must to move forward. The market doesn't wait for morning. No, it doesn't, I said, stepping even closer, so close I could smell the peat of his scotch and the sour tang of his anxiety. I lowered my voice to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. But sometimes, Julian, the past has a way of catching up. It's like a debt that hasn't been settled. Eventually, the interest becomes too high to pay. I saw the moment the seed was planted. A flicker of genuine fear crossed his face, a realization that he was outmatched by this woman he didn't know. He opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to ask what I meant, but I didn't give him the chance. I offered him a thin, sharp smile, the kind a predator gives a cornered animal, and stepped back. Enjoy your drink, Julian, I said, turning away before he could recover. I have a feeling we'll be seeing a lot more of each other very soon. I walked back into the crowd, the charcoal silk of my dress whispering against my legs. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel his eyes on my back, a frantic, searching gaze that would follow him into his dreams tonight. The first crack had been made. The ghost was no longer a memory. She was a physical presence in the room, a shadow moving among the lights, and the hunt had officially begun. I didn't have to look back to know he was following me. A man like Julian, a man built on the hollow scaffolding of stolen ideas and borrowed prestige, cannot resist the pull of a superior power. He is a scavenger by nature, always looking for the next scrap of brilliance to claim as his own, and tonight I had presented him with a feast. I moved through the ballroom with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, the silk of my gown creating a soft, rhythmic friction against my skin that grounded me, keeping me tethered to the present while my mind calculated the trajectory of his pursuit. I could hear the heavy, uneven thrum of his footsteps behind me, a stark contrast to the polished, synchronized movements of the waitstaff and the rhythmic chatter of the elite. I reached the tall, arched doors leading to the terrace, where the air was crisp and carried the faint, briny scent of the East River. The transition from the stifling, perfume-choked heat of the ballroom to the cool night air was like a baptism. I walked to the stone balustrade and looked out over the city, the lights of Manhattan shimmering like a hoard of diamonds scattered across black velvet. I didn't turn when the door creaked behind me, nor when the smell of his expensive, peaty scotch preceded his voice. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice slightly more stable now, though the tremor was still there, hidden beneath a layer of forced bravado. You can't simply drop a comment like that and walk away. It's bad form, even for a woman of your reputation. I turned slowly, resting one elbow on the cold stone of the railing. The moonlight caught the silver in my hair, turning it into a crown of frosted glass. I let a small, mocking smile play across my lips. Reputation is a tool, Julian. It opens doors, but it's the information behind the reputation that keeps them open. I assumed a man of your ambition would understand that. He stepped closer, the orange glow of a distant street lamp catching the sweat that now openly slicked his forehead. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago, the cracks in his carefully curated facade widening under the pressure of my presence. You mentioned my firm's restructuring. You mentioned the interest on a debt. If the Vance Group is looking to move against us, I'd rather you say it plainly. Move against you, I laughed, a low, melodic sound that seemed to vibrate in the cool air. My dear Julian, you think too small. I have no interest in destroying you. Destruction is messy, and frankly, it's beneath me. I am here because I see an opportunity. I see a firm that is over-leveraged, gasping for air after a series of acquisitions that were, shall we say, more optimistic than wise. You've swallowed more than you can digest, and now you're looking for someone to help you swallow the rest. He flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of the jaw, but it told me everything. I had hit the mark. Julian had always been a gambler, but he lacked the stomach for the losses. He had been playing with my money, my legacy, and now that the well was running dry, he was terrified. We're perfectly stable, he lied, though his hand went instinctively to his French cuffs, tugging at the gold links as if they were handcuffs. Don't bore me with the PR script, I said, my voice hardening. I know about the Helios project. I know the capital you sank into the offshore wind farms in the North Sea is currently tied up in a regulatory nightmare that won't resolve for at least 3 years. I know your liquidity is at a 10-year low. And I know that if you don't find a significant influx of cash by the end of the quarter, your board is going to start looking for a scapegoat, and we both know who that will be. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Julian's face went pale, a sickly, translucent white in the moonlight. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. I was the monster under his bed, but I was also the only one offering him a hand. How do you know about Helios? He whispered. That's confidential. Only the executive committee. The executive committee is a sieve, Julian. People talk when they're afraid, and they are very, very afraid. I stepped toward him, closing the distance until I was once again in his personal space. I could see the broken capillaries in his eyes, the evidence of too many late nights and too much stress. But I have a solution. The Vance Group is looking to diversify into the very sectors you're currently drowning in. We have the capital to absorb your debt, to provide the liquidity you need to stay afloat until Helios goes live. But we don't work with just anyone. We work with people we trust, people who are willing to listen. I saw the bait take hold. He wanted to believe me. He needed to believe that this mysterious, powerful woman was his savior. It was the same vanity I had exploited years ago, the same need for approval that had made him so easy to manipulate when I was his partner. He wanted to be the hero who saved the firm, the man who brought in the legendary Alina Vance to secure their future. What do you want? He asked, his voice hushed. I want a seat at the table, I said. Not officially, not yet. I want you to be my eyes and ears inside the firm. I'll provide the strategy, the inside moves that will drive your stock price up before the quarterly report. You'll be the one who presents them. You'll be the visionary, and in return, the Vance Group will quietly begin acquiring your debt through a series of shell corporations. By the time the market realizes what's happened, you'll be untouchable. It was a beautiful lie. Every word was a meticulously crafted poison. The strategy I would give him would be designed to inflate the firm's value artificially, creating a bubble that would eventually burst with catastrophic force. The debt I would acquire would actually be funneled into high risk instruments that would default the moment I pulled the plug. I wasn't saving him, I was building him a golden gallows. Julian took a deep breath, his chest swelling with a newfound sense of importance. I could see the gears turning, the way he was already imagining the praise from the board, the headlines in the Wall Street Journal. He was a man drowning, and I had just handed him an anchor made of lead, painted to look like a life preserver. I would need to see the terms, he said, trying to regain some semblance of professional dignity. Of course, I replied, my voice softening into a purr. I wouldn't expect anything less from a man of your caliber. My assistant will send over a preliminary memorandum tomorrow morning. Read it, digest it, and then, Julian, we will begin. I reached out and adjusted his tie, my fingers brushing against the silk. He shivered at the touch, a reaction born of both fear and a perverse kind of attraction. He was under my spell now, a puppet who didn't yet realize his strings were being replaced with razor wire. I should get back inside, he said, his eyes darting toward the door. People will notice my absence. Yes, they will, I said, stepping back. But soon, Julian, they'll notice you for all the right reasons. I watched him walk away, his stride more confident now, his shoulders squared. He thought he had found a way out. He thought he had found a partner who finally understood his worth. As the door closed behind him, I turned back to the city skyline. The wind picked up, whipping a strand of my silver hair across my face. I didn't brush it away. I stood there in the cold, a ghost in a silk dress, watching the lights of the city and feeling the first true spark of warmth in my chest since the day they had left me for dead. The chess match had begun, and Julian had just moved his king into the center of the board, thinking he was making an attack. He had no idea that the game had been over before he even sat down. I leaned against the balustrade, the cold stone seeping through the fabric of my dress, and I allowed myself a single, sharp moment of memory. I remembered the smell of the smoke, the taste of the salt water, and the sound of their laughter as they drove away, leaving me to the dark. They thought I was a memory. They thought they had erased me. But as I looked out over the empire they had built on the ruins of my life, I knew that I was the only thing in this city that was truly real. The rest of them, Julian, Marcus, and the others, they were just shadows. And shadows always disappear when the light gets too bright. I would be that light. I would be the fire that burned it all down, and from the ashes I would finally take back what was mine. I took a final deep breath of the night air, savoring the taste of the coming storm. Then I turned and walked back into the ballroom, my head held high, a predator returning to the tall grass, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The music was louder now, a frantic, pulsing beat that seemed to mirror the acceleration of my own heart. I moved through the crowd, no longer a stranger, but the architect of their impending ruin. I saw Julian across the room, holding a fresh glass of scotch, talking animatedly to a group of investors. He caught my eye and offered a small, conspiratorial nod. I didn't return it. I simply watched him, a cold, clinical observer of his own demise, and I felt the weight of the years falling away, replaced by the heavy, satisfying gravity of revenge. The transition from the gala's opulence to the clinical, sharp-edged reality of the following Monday was seamless for me, though for Sarah and Marcus, the world was beginning to tilt on its axis. I watched the sunrise from my own sanctuary, a quiet, darkened room filled with the hum of servers and the soft glow of multiple monitors, my cockpit for the destruction of their lives. I had spent years studying the blueprints of their empire, not just the physical structures of steel and glass they occupied, but the psychological architecture they had built around themselves. Their corporate headquarters, a shimmering monolith of obsidian glass and brushed aluminum in the heart of the financial district, had always been a temple to their shared arrogance. It was designed to intimidate, to project an image of impenetrable strength and absolute transparency. But as I began to feed the first carefully curated discrepancies to my contacts in the press, that transparency became their greatest liability. I had started small, a whisper to a hungry investigative reporter at a mid tier financial blog about a clerical oversight in the Regency merger from 3 years ago. It was a minor thread, easily ignored by the public, but to those inside the building, it was the first sign of a moth in the closet. By Tuesday afternoon, the atmosphere in their executive suite had shifted. I watched through a compromised security feed as the once pristine silence of the floor was replaced by a frantic, vibrating energy. The staff, usually a well oiled machine of sycophants and high achievers, moved with a newfound hesitancy. They could smell the blood in the water, even if they didn't know whose it was yet. I focused my gaze on Sarah's office. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design: white marble floors, a desk carved from a single block of translucent quartz, and floor to ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city she thought she owned. Sarah was a woman who thrived on control. She curated her life with the same ruthlessness she used to curate her portfolio. But today, the control was slipping. She stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the bright sky, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wasn't looking at the view. She was staring at her reflection in the glass, searching for a crack she couldn't yet see. Marcus entered without knocking. In the past, their movements had been a choreographed dance of mutual ambition. Now his entry was a rupture. He was a large man, prone to filling a room with his physical presence, but today he looked diminished, his expensive charcoal suit hanging slightly loose as if he had lost weight in the last 12 hours. He threw a tablet onto her quartz desk with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the sterile room. "Have you seen this?" His voice was a low growl, stripped of its usual bravado. Sarah didn't turn around immediately. She let the silence stretch, a power play that felt increasingly hollow. When she finally faced him, her expression was a mask of cold indifference, but I saw the way her fingers twitched against her elbows. "It's a blog post, Marcus, a nothing burger from a writer looking for clicks. We don't dignify it with a response. It's not just a blog post," Marcus snapped, pacing the length of the office like a caged animal. "The SEC reached out to my head of compliance an hour ago. They're asking for the audit trails on the Regency acquisition. Someone gave them the internal ledger, Sarah, not the one we filed, the real one." I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. I had sent that ledger via an encrypted drop 3 nights ago. It wasn't the whole truth, not yet, but it contained enough irregularities to trigger a formal inquiry. "The real one doesn't exist," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We made sure of that. If there's a leak, it's coming from your side of the house. Your people handled the back-end integration." "My people," Marcus laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "My people are loyal because they're afraid of me. Your people are loyal because they think they're going to be you one day." Maybe one of them decided they didn't want to wait. The suspicion was a poison, and I was the one holding the syringe. For years, they had operated as a single predatory organism, their trust built on the bedrock of shared crimes. But take away the security of their success, and that trust revealed itself for what it truly was: a fragile alliance of convenience. I watched as the argument escalated, though the glass walls of the office kept their words from the ears of the assistants outside. To the rest of the floor, it looked like a standard high-stakes meeting, but the body language told a different story. Marcus was leaning over the desk, his face flushed, his gestures wild and accusatory. Sarah remained stationary, a block of ice, but her eyes were darting toward the door, toward the phones, toward the exits. The temple was becoming a tomb. By Wednesday, the hushed conversations had become the primary mode of communication in the building. I had released the second tip, a series of emails between Marcus and a shell company in the Caymans discussing consulting fees that bore a striking resemblance to kickbacks from a public infrastructure project. These were documents I had painstakingly reconstructed from the fragmented drives they thought they had destroyed. The press was no longer whispering, they were shouting. The Wall Street Journal had picked up the story, and the headline was a serrated blade, cracks in the Obsidian Empire, Integrity Holdings faces allegations of fraud. The physical space of the office reflected their internal decay. The cleaning crews seemed to be skipping corners. A layer of dust settled on the expensive art, and a flickering fluorescent light in the hallway went unrepaired, casting a rhythmic, nerve-wracking strobe over the executive wing. The air conditioning felt colder, the smell of ozone from the overworked server rooms more pungent. I watched Marcus through the camera in the break room. He was pouring a cup of coffee, his hand shaking so badly that the liquid splashed over the rim, staining the white marble counter. He didn't clean it up. He just stared at the brown puddle, his eyes wide and unfocused. He looked like a man who was realizing, for the first time, that the ground beneath him wasn't solid. Sarah, meanwhile, had retreated into a bunker mentality. She had locked herself in her office, refusing all calls except from her legal team. But I knew what she was doing. She was searching. She was going through every file, every transaction, every memory of the last 5 years, trying to find the source of the leak. She was looking for a ghost. She would never find me in the numbers because I wasn't just in the numbers. I was in the air they breathed. I was the doubt that kept them awake at night. I was the reason they no longer looked each other in the eye. Late that evening, when the sun had dipped below the horizon and the city lights began to twinkle with a cruel indifference, I saw them meet one last time in the boardroom. The room was a vast expanse of mahogany and leather, dominated by a table that could seat 30. They sat at opposite ends, two islands in a sea of shadow. "We need to cut Julian loose," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the empty space. I had my audio gain turned up high. I could hear the rasp of his breath. "If we give them Julian, maybe they'll stop looking at the rest of it. He's the weak link. He's already talking to that woman, that investor from the gala." Sarah looked up, her face pale in the dim light. "Julian knows too much, Marcus. If we push him overboard, he'll take us with him." "Not if we move first," Marcus replied, his voice hardening. "We frame it as a rogue operation. He was the one who handled the Regency filings. We just signed off on what he gave us. We play the victims of his ambition." I watched Sarah's expression change. The ice was melting, replaced by a calculating, predatory gleam. She was considering it. She was ready to devour her own to survive. It was exactly what I had predicted. They were no longer a team. They were two survivors on a sinking lifeboat, and they were both looking for someone to throw overboard to lighten the load. "I have the documents," Sarah said softly. "The ones that show Julian's unauthorized signatures on the offshore transfers. I've had them in a safe for 2 years, just in case." Marcus stared at her, a mixture of relief and newfound terror. He realized then that she had been prepared to betray him, too, if the need arose. The fracture was complete. The unity that had allowed them to destroy me was gone, replaced by a cold, mutual realization that they were each other's greatest threat. I turned off the monitors and sat in the darkness, the silence of my room a stark contrast to the screaming paranoia I had unleashed in theirs. The first phase was complete. They were turning on themselves, the temple of their success now a labyrinth of suspicion and fear. They thought they were playing a game of survival, but they didn't realize that I was the one who had written the rules. And in my game, no one gets out alive. I stood up, stretching my limbs, feeling the strength returning to my body with every piece of their world that crumbled. Tomorrow, I would visit Julian. I would give him the evidence he needed to protect himself from them. And then I would watch as the fire I had started finally consumed them all. I met Julian in a small, damp park 3 blocks from the terminal, a place where the wind always seemed to carry the scent of exhaust and wet asphalt. He looked smaller than he had only a week ago, his expensive wool coat hanging off his shoulders as if he'd shrunk within his own skin. His eyes were bloodshot, darting toward every passing car, every pedestrian walking a dog. He was a man who had spent his life building a fortress of lies, and now that the walls were cracking, he realized he had no idea how to survive in the open air. I handed him the envelope, the insurance I had promised. It contained a carefully curated selection of documents, some real, some masterfully forged, all designed to make it look like Marcus and Sarah had been funneling the lion's share of the Regency profits into accounts Julian didn't even know existed. I watched him clutch it to his chest like a holy relic. He thanked me with a desperation that made my skin crawl, and I smiled, the kind of gentle, reassuring smile a predator gives to a wounded animal before the final strike. I told him to keep it safe, to wait for the right moment. I didn't tell him that the moment would be his own undoing. The drive to Marcus's estate, a sprawling nightmare of neoclassical architecture nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, took nearly 3 hours. As the city's skyline faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the oppressive green of manicured forests and the gray stone of ancient fences, I felt a familiar coldness settle in my bones. This was the heart of the beast. This was the place built with the pieces of my life they had torn away. The iron gates groaned as they swung open, a sound like a low, metallic warning. The gravel driveway was a mile long, a crunching, rhythmic path that led toward a house that didn't so much sit on the land as it did dominate it. It was a monument to excess, all white marble and soaring glass, illuminated by floodlights that made it glow with a ghostly, artificial brilliance against the darkening sky. Marcus was waiting for me on the terrace. He stood silhouetted against the light of the grand foyer, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. As I stepped out of the car, the air smelled of blooming jasmine and the sharp, ozone tang of an approaching storm. He looked every bit the master of the manor, but as I climbed the wide stone steps, I saw the tells he couldn't hide. The way his shoulders were hiked toward his ears, the way he gripped his glass until his knuckles were white as bone. He was a man trying to project power while his world turned to ash behind his eyes. "You made it," he said, his voice a practiced baritone that lacked its usual resonance. "I wasn't sure you'd want to spend a weekend in the middle of nowhere with a man facing a public relations crisis." "I've always preferred the middle of nowhere, Marcus," I replied, my voice smooth and devoid of the hatred that burned in my throat. "It's where things are most honest." He led me inside, and the luxury of the house hit me like a physical blow. It was a facade of impeccable taste. Every rug was silk, every painting an original, every piece of furniture a bespoke creation of wood and leather. But to me, it smelled of decay. I saw the missed details, the slight film of dust on the crystal chandelier in the entryway, the way the heavy velvet curtains hung slightly crookedly, as if the staff had lost the will to keep up the charade. We moved to the library, a room lined with thousands of books that I knew for a fact Marcus had never read. They were there for the aesthetic of wisdom, a library for a man who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. He poured me a glass of wine, a vintage Bordeaux that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. We sat in two high-backed leather chairs facing a fireplace that remained cold and empty. The silence between us was heavy, a living thing that pulsed with the weight of what we weren't saying. I watched him over the rim of my glass. He looked older. The fine lines around his eyes had deepened into trenches, and the skin of his throat was loose. He was 54, but in this light he looked 70. The board is panicked, he said abruptly, staring into the dark hearth. Sarah is not herself. She's seeing ghosts in every corner of the office. It's a difficult time for the firm, I said, my tone perfectly neutral. Integrity is a fragile thing, Marcus. Once the first crack appears, the whole structure tends to follow. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of something mockery, perhaps, or pity. He found neither. I had spent years perfecting the art of being a mirror. I showed him only what he wanted to see, which was a sympathetic ear, a confidant who didn't judge him for the mistakes of his past. I built this, he whispered, gesturing vaguely at the room, the house, the estate. I did what I had to do. People don't understand the pressure. They don't understand that at this level, there are no clean hands. You have to be willing to get them dirty to keep the lights on. I understand better than most, I said, and the truth of it tasted like copper in my mouth. I remembered the night he had signed the papers that stripped me of my equity, the night he had looked me in the eye and told me it was just business. I remembered the coldness of his hand when he shook mine, discarding a decade of my loyalty as if it were a used napkin. He took a long, desperate swallow of his wine. Julian is the problem. He's always been the weak one. He's cracking. I can see it. He's going to try to save himself by throwing us to the wolves. Then you have to be the one to throw first, I suggested softly. I watched the thought take root in his mind, the same thought I had seen him and Sarah nurture in the boardroom. Survival isn't about being the strongest, Marcus. It's about being the last one standing when the music stops. He nodded, a slow, rhythmic movement. He was hooked. He was so consumed by his own fear that he couldn't see the hook in his own jaw. He saw me as his ally, his advisor, the one person who wasn't currently trying to subpoena his records or leak his emails. He didn't realize that I was the one who had bought the music, and I was the one who was about to cut the power. As the night wore on, the wine took hold of him. His speech became slightly slurred, his movements clumsy. He began to talk about the glory days, about the deals they had closed and the people they had crushed. He spoke of them with a sickening nostalgia, as if destroying lives was a sport they had excelled at. I listened, my heart a cold stone in my chest, calculating the exact moment of his fall. I looked around the room at the heavy mahogany desk where he likely kept his most private files, at the safe hidden behind a landscape painting of the Scottish Highlands. I knew the codes, I knew the secrets, and within 48 hours, the rest of the world would know them too. I stood up, claiming exhaustion from the drive. Marcus stood too, swaying slightly on his feet. He reached out and squeezed my arm, a gesture he intended as one of friendship, but it felt like the touch of a corpse. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his eyes unfocused. "I feel like I can trust you." "You can, Marcus," I replied, my voice a whisper of silk. "I'm the only one who truly knows what you deserve." I walked up the grand staircase to the guest suite, my footsteps silenced by the thick carpet. As I closed the door to my room, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the window, looking out over the dark expanse of the estate. Somewhere out there, the storm was finally breaking. The first flash of lightning illuminated the grounds, turning the white marble of the house into a jagged, skeletal white. The fire was coming, and I was the only one who knew that the house was already soaked in gasoline. I sat on the edge of the bed, the darkness of the room wrapping around me like a shroud, and for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of their ruin, and the foundation was already crumbling. The morning light was a cold, surgical gray, peeling back the shadows of the estate with an indifference that made the previous night's revelations feel like a fever dream. I stood before the vanity mirror in the guest suite, my fingers tracing the line of my jaw, a jawline that had been subtly altered, softened by time and the hands of a very expensive surgeon in Geneva, yet still holding the architecture of the woman I used to be. I applied my makeup with the precision of a soldier preparing for a siege. Every layer of foundation was a brick in a wall. Every stroke of eyeliner was a sharpening of my intent. By the time I walked down the grand staircase, I was no longer the woman who had wept in the dark. I was a phantom in a silk blouse, a ghost who had learned to breathe again. The breakfast room was a glass-walled cage that looked out over the manicured gardens. Marcus was there, huddled over a cup of black coffee, looking every bit the man whose world was held together by scotch and secrets. But it wasn't Marcus who made the air in my lungs turn to liquid nitrogen. It was Sarah. She was sitting opposite him, her tablet open, her fingers flying across the screen with the same frantic energy I remembered from a lifetime ago. She had been my assistant, the one I had hand-picked, the one I had mentored, the one who had ultimately held the door open for the men who came to take my life away. She looked older, the youth stripped from her face by the same grinding gears of the firm that were now crushing Marcus. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain the skin of her forehead, and her eyes were rimmed with the red fatigue of the damned. "Good morning," I said, my voice pitched at that perfect, neutral frequency I had cultivated, low, melodic, and entirely devoid of the sharp edges of my past. Sarah didn't look up immediately. "Morning," she muttered, her focus still on the screen. "Marcus, the auditors are asking for the 2018 ledger again. Julian says he can't find the digital backup." "Julian is a fool," Marcus snapped, his voice gravelly from the wine. "Tell him to look harder, or tell him to make one, I don't care which." I took my seat, the silk of my skirt whispering against the leather chair. I poured myself a cup of tea, my movements slow and deliberate. I could feel Sarah's gaze drift toward me. It started as a casual glance, the way one acknowledges a guest, but then it lingered. I felt the weight of her scrutiny like a physical pressure against my skin. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," Sarah said, her voice trailing off as she squinted at me. "I'm Sarah, Marcus's chief of staff." "A pleasure, Sarah," I replied, meeting her eyes with a blank, polite smile. "I'm an old friend of the family, helping Marcus navigate some personal transitions." The moment I spoke, Sarah's entire posture changed. She didn't blink. Her head tilted slightly to the left, a gesture I knew well. It was the way she looked when she was trying to solve a complex filing error. My heart, which had been a steady, rhythmic thrum, suddenly lurched. It began to hammer against my ribs with a violence that I feared she could see through the fabric of my blouse. A cold sweat broke out at the base of my spine, but I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I kept my hand steady as I raised the teacup to my lips. "Your voice," Sarah whispered, her brow furrowing. I know that cadence. Have we met before? At a conference, perhaps, or the London office?" The panic was a white-hot flare in my brain. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the memories of 1,000 morning briefings, 1,000 dictated memos, all beginning to align. She was a bloodhound. I had trained her to be one. I had taught her to listen for the subtext in a client's tone, to recognize the subtle shifts in a competitor's delivery. Now that training was turned against me. "I've spent a great deal of time in London," I said, my voice a mask of ice, "but I doubt our paths crossed. I tend to stay behind the scenes. Unlike you, Sarah, I prefer the shadows to the spotlight." I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. She was still searching. She was looking for the woman she had betrayed, looking for the ghost she thought was buried under years of litigation and silence. It's uncanny, Sarah persisted, her voice rising slightly. Marcus, doesn't she sound just like someone who knows how to mind their own business? I interrupted, my tone sharpening just enough to draw blood. I set the teacup down with a sharp clack against the saucer. I didn't look at her with fear. I looked at her with the cold, predatory boredom of a woman who was losing her patience. Marcus looked up, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. Sarah, for God's sake, stop interrogating the woman. You're seeing ghosts again. That's exactly what Julian was talking about this morning. I seized the opening Marcus had inadvertently provided. I turned my gaze back to Sarah, but this time there was a calculated pity in my expression. I let my voice drop into a conspiratorial, soothing register, the kind used for a child or a lunatic. You seem stressed, Sarah, I said softly. It's understandable. Marcus mentioned that things have been unstable. When the mind is under this much pressure, it looks for patterns where none exist. It looks for familiar faces in the crowd to anchor itself. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto hers, projecting a terrifying artificial warmth. But you should be careful who you listen to. Marcus told me that Julian has been expressing concerns about your focus. He mentioned you've been imagining things, leaks, discrepancies, shadows. Sarah's face went pale. The recognition in her eyes was instantly replaced by a sharp, jagged, defensive instinct. The mention of Julian, the man she was currently locked in a power struggle with, acted like a lightning rod, grounding her suspicion and redirecting it inward. Julian said what? She hissed, her eyes darting to Marcus. Marcus, caught in the middle of a lie he didn't even realize I was constructing, simply grunted. He's worried, Sarah. We're all worried. You're wound too tight. You're starting to snap at shadows. I watched the collapse of her confidence with a clinical detachment that surprised even me. I felt no guilt. I felt no flicker of the mentor-student bond we had once shared. I felt only the cold, hard satisfaction of a job well done. I had taken her intuition, the very thing that made her dangerous, and I had framed it as a symptom of her mental decay. I had turned her own boss against her, using his paranoia to feed hers. I'm sorry if I startled you, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked back at her tablet, her fingers shaking so much she could barely type. I haven't been sleeping well. Julian has been. He's been making things very difficult. I'm sure he has, I said, my voice as smooth as a whetstone. Men like Julian often wait for the first sign of weakness to move in. You should be careful, Sarah. Paranoia is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you keep looking for ghosts, you might just find yourself replaced by one. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, the warmth of the liquid finally reaching my chest. The hammering in my ribs had subsided, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline calm. I had just dismantled her in front of the man she served, and I had done it using the very tools they had used on me: gaslighting, redirection, and the weaponization of loyalty. As Sarah gathered her things and hurried out of the room, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow, Marcus sighed and rubbed his temples. She's losing it, he muttered. They're all losing it. Not everyone, Marcus, I said, watching the morning sun catch the edge of a silver spoon. Some of us are just getting started. I looked out at the garden, at the roses that were beginning to wilt in the autumn chill. I had become the thing I feared most, the cold-blooded architect of another person's misery. And as I sat there in the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the ruins of their integrity, I realized that I didn't mind the cold at all. In fact, I had never felt more alive. The fire I had promised was no longer a metaphor. It was a living thing, breathing in the room with us, and I was the one holding the match. Marcus didn't stay much longer after Sarah's hasty, humiliated exit. He was a man who had spent his entire life learning how to ignore the smell of smoke until the flames were licking at his own heels, and even then he would likely try to negotiate with the fire. He muttered something about meetings and damage control, a phrase that had become his mantra over the last few weeks and left me alone in the quiet of the morning room. I watched him go, his gait heavy, his expensive Italian loafers scuffing against the polished hardwood, a sound of subtle, creeping decay. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the silence of a fuse burning down to its end. The first domino fell 3 days later on a Tuesday that smelled of impending rain and ozone. I was sitting in the small, sun-drenched breakfast nook of my rented cottage, a place they didn't know about, a place that felt like a sanctuary of my own making. I had the television on, the volume turned low, a habit from a life lived in the shadows of other people's tempers. Then the ticker tape at the bottom of the screen began to scroll with a frantic, rhythmic urgency that made my heart skip a beat. Breaking news. Federal authorities execute search warrant A.T. Vane and Associates headquarters. CEO Julian Vane taken into custody. I didn't move. I didn't cheer. I simply set my coffee cup down on the coaster, my hands perfectly steady. I watched as the live feed cut to the glass and steel monolith that Julian had called his kingdom. It looked different through the lens of a news camera, cold, sterile, and suddenly very fragile. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers strobed against the reflective windows, turning the symbol of his power into a cheap, gaudy siren. And then I saw him. The doors swung open, and the swarm of agents emerged, flanking a figure that seemed to have shrunk in the 3 days since I'd last seen him. Julian Vane, the man who had once told me I was nothing but a collection of useful habits, was being led out in handcuffs. He wasn't wearing his usual bespoke suit. He was in a rumpled navy blazer. His hair, usually slicked back with the precision of a scalpel, was matted and windblown. But it was his face that held me captive. The camera zoomed in, catching that split second where the mask of the untouchable Titan cracked. His eyes were wide, darting from side to side with a frantic, animalistic terror. He looked small. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that the ground beneath his feet was made of nothing but his own lies, and it had finally given way. The powerful don't just fall, they disintegrate. They become frantic, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if they've forgotten how to inhabit a body that is no longer shielded by money and influence. I watched him duck his head, trying to hide from the very cameras he had spent a decade courting, and I felt a visceral, bone-deep satisfaction that tasted like iron and honey. The news anchor's voice was a droning backdrop to the symphony of his ruin. They spoke of unprecedented financial discrepancies, anonymous whistleblowers, and evidence of systemic racketeering. They didn't know my name. They didn't know that the anonymous whistleblower was a woman they thought had been broken beyond repair, a woman who had spent months meticulously stitching together the very noose that was now tightening around Julian's neck. But the fall wasn't limited to Julian. The dominoes were falling in a tight, lethal sequence. By that evening, the reports shifted to Sarah. I had anticipated her reaction perfectly. Sarah was a creature of logic and survival, but her logic was built on the foundation of Julian's invincibility. When that foundation crumbled, she didn't try to fight, she panicked. The news reported that she had failed to show up for questioning. Her apartment had been found in disarray, her go bag, the one she thought I didn't know about, missing from its hiding place. I pictured her in that moment, the ice queen who had tried to gaslight me over tea. I imagined her in a cheap motel room, or perhaps at a terminal in a secondary airport, her fingers trembling as she tried to book a flight to a country without an extradition treaty. I could see the sweat on her upper lip, the way her eyes would be red-rimmed and hollowed out by the sheer, jagged weight of her own fear. She had spent so long looking for ghosts in the hallway that she hadn't realized she was the one being haunted. She was a fugitive now, a woman with no name and no future, fleeing from the very shadow she had helped Julian cast over me. The shift in them was what fascinated me the most. When they were in power, they moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. They spoke in low tones, confident that the world would bend to their whispers. But in the collapse, they became shrill. They became frantic. The empire they had built was revealed for what it truly was, a house of cards held together by the silence of the people they had crushed. And once I broke that silence, the wind did the rest. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The rain had finally started to fall, a soft, cleansing drizzle that blurred the edges of the world. I felt a cold clarity that was almost transcendental. For years, I had been the one hiding, the one flinching at every loud noise, the one who believed that their power was an immutable law of nature. I had been the victim of their architecture, a ghost in my own life. But now, as I watched the news cycle repeat the images of Julian's arrest and the reports of Sarah's flight, I realized that I was the architect now. I had rebuilt myself out of the rubble they had left behind, and I had used the sharpest pieces to cut them down. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of red wine, the color of a bruised sunset. I raised it to the television screen, to the image of Julian being pushed into the back of a police car. To the ghost's Julian, I whispered, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had once defined me. I hope they keep you awake at night. I drank the wine, feeling its warmth spread through my chest, a stark contrast to the icy, calculated stillness of my mind. The end was approaching, the final act of a play I had written in the dark. They had thought I would never recover. They had banked on my fragility, on the idea that a woman broken could never put herself back together with a sharp enough edge to draw blood. They were wrong. I wasn't just recovered, I was reinvented. And as the empire crumbled on the screen before me, I knew that the fire I had started wouldn't stop until there was nothing left but ash. And from that ash, I would finally, truly be free. The wine was a cold comfort, a temporary indulgence before the final, most delicate piece of the architecture was set into place. I didn't sleep much that night. I didn't need to. The adrenaline that had been my constant companion for months had refined itself into something sharper, a quiet, humming energy that vibrated in my marrow. By the time the sun began to bleed through the gray morning clouds, I was already dressed. I chose a suit of charcoal wool, tailored so precisely it felt like armor, and a silk blouse the color of a winter sky. I looked in the mirror and saw Alina Vance, composed, enigmatic, and lethal. But beneath the mask, the woman they thought they had buried was screaming to be let out, not in agony, but in anticipation. The office building stood like a monolith against the city skyline, a glass and steel monument to the very power I was about to dismantle. Walking through the lobby, I felt the familiar hum of the ventilation, the scent of expensive floor wax, and the hushed, hurried footsteps of people who believed they were important. I took the private elevator to the top floor, the one that required a keycard I shouldn't have had, but which my consulting role had graciously provided. When the doors slid open, I was greeted by the silence of a tomb. The reception desk was empty. The news of Julian's arrest had sent the support staff into a frantic retreat. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the corner office, the office that had once been mine. The name on the door had been changed years ago, replaced by a brass plate that read Marcus Thorne. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open and stepped inside. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of old sweat. Marcus was sitting behind the desk, my desk, but he didn't look like the titan of industry I remembered. He looked small. He was hunched over a stack of legal documents, his tie loosened, his shirt wrinkled and damp at the armpits. The man who had once loomed over me, radiating a terrifying, casual cruelty, was now a portrait of decomposition. His hair, once a sharp, silver mane, was thin and unkempt, and the skin beneath his eyes was sagged into bruised pockets of exhaustion. He didn't look up at first. "I told you no calls," he snapped, his voice raspy and thin. "I don't care if it's the SEC or the Pope, tell them I'm out." "I'm not here to take a message, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, echoing slightly in the cavernous room. He froze. That was the first victory, the way his shoulders locked, the way the pen in his hand stopped mid-stroke. He slowly raised his head, his eyes squinting as if trying to resolve an image that didn't make sense. He saw Alina Vance. He saw the woman who had spent the last 3 months advising his firm, the woman who had saved his accounts while secretly bleeding them dry. "Elena," he breathed, a pathetic ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Thank God, you've seen the news. Julian it's a mess. Sarah has vanished. I need you to run the contingency protocols. We need to move the offshore holdings before the freeze hits." He was desperate. He was reaching for me like a drowning man reaching for a jagged rock. I walked across the room, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor, and stopped at the edge of the desk. I looked down at him, and for a moment I saw the ghost of myself reflected in his panicked pupils, the woman who had sat in this very chair pleading for her life while he laughed and signed away her future. "The contingency protocols are already in effect, Marcus," I said softly, "but they aren't yours." He frowned, a flicker of confusion crossing his weathered face. "What are you talking about?" "Alina, listen to me. I can pay you double, triple, just get those accounts cleared." I leaned forward, resting my palms on the cool surface of the desk. I let the silence stretch between us, thick and suffocating, until I could hear the frantic, uneven thud of his heart. Then I let the mask slip. I didn't change my expression, but I changed my eyes. I let the cold, calculated persona of Alina Vance dissolve, leaving only the raw, burning essence of the woman he had destroyed. "My name isn't Elena," I whispered. The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. He stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open, his brain struggling to bridge the gap between the woman standing before him and the woman he thought was a broken, forgotten memory. I watched the realization dawning, a slow, agonizing crawl of recognition. He looked at the shape of my jaw, the tilt of my head, the specific icy blue of my eyes that no amount of colored contacts could truly hide once the light hit them just right. "You," he choked out, the word caught in a throat constricted by terror. "It's not possible. You were gone. We made sure you were gone." "You made sure I was broken," I corrected him, my voice dropping an octave, losing the light, professional lilt of the consultant. "You made sure I was silenced. You made sure I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and a reputation you dragged through the dirt. But you forgot one thing, Marcus." I stood up straight, reclaimed my full height, and looked down at him with a coldness that felt like a physical weight. "You forgot that I knew how the house was built, and I knew exactly which pillars to pull." He tried to stand, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over a crystal glass of water. It shattered on the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet office. He looked at the shards, then back at me, his chest heaving. "What have you done?" I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick blue folder. I tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding across the mahogany until it hit his trembling hands. "That is the evidence of the last 12 years," I said. The shell companies, the kickbacks, the environmental violations you buried in the valley, the offshore accounts you used to fund Julian's political aspirations. Every signature, every timestamp, every digital footprint you thought you'd erased. I didn't just find them, Marcus, I curated them. He fumbled with the folder, his fingers clumsy as he flipped through the pages. I watched his eyes dart across the documents, bank statements he thought were shredded, emails he thought were encrypted, photos of meetings he thought were private. With every page he turned, he seemed to shrink further into his chair, the weight of his own ruin pressing down on him. This is everything, he whispered, his voice breaking. You'll go down too, you were part of this. I smiled then, a slow, predatory curve of my lips that didn't reach my eyes. No, Marcus, Alina Vance was part of this. And Alina Vance doesn't exist. She's a ghost, a paper trail that leads to nowhere. But you're very real, and the authorities are downstairs right now. I imagine they'll be up here in about 5 minutes. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and a twisted kind of awe. He realized then that I hadn't just come for revenge, I had come for a total, systemic erasure of his existence. I had used his own greed, his own arrogance to build the cage he was now trapped in. I thought I killed you, he said, a strange, hollow laugh escaping him. You did, I replied, turning toward the door. But you didn't realize that the woman who came back was much, much better at your game than you ever were. I walked out of the office, leaving him alone in the ruins of my old life. As I reached the elevator, I heard the heavy thud of boots on the stairs, the sound of the world finally catching up to him. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the image of the man who had once been my nightmare, now reduced to a shivering, broken relic. As the elevator descended, I felt the last of the iron in my blood turn to honey. The architecture was complete, the house had fallen, and I was finally, truly walking out into the light. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing me into a small, mirrored box of brushed steel and silence. For a moment, I just stood there, my hands hanging loosely at my sides, watching the floor numbers count down in a steady, rhythmic glow of amber light. 32, 31, 30. The descent was smooth, almost imperceptible, yet I felt every foot of distance I was putting between myself and the man who had tried to erase me. My reflection stared back at me from the polished walls, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit, her hair pinned back in a severe, professional knot, her face a mask of calm composure. But as the numbers ticked lower, I watched that mask begin to crack at the edges, not with fear and not with the frantic adrenaline of the hunt, but with something far more profound. It was the slow, steady thaw of a long frozen river. I reached up and touched my throat, my fingers grazing the skin where a jagged line of scar tissue hid beneath the silk collar of my blouse. It was a souvenir from the night they thought they'd finished the job, a physical reminder of the moment my old life ended and this long, calculated haunting began. For years, that scar had throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant, stinging pulse of resentment and rage. It had been the compass by which I navigated every decision, every lie, and every shadow I'd stepped into. But now, as the elevator reached the 20th floor, I realized the stinging was gone. The skin felt cool, numb, and remarkably ordinary. It was just a mark. It was history, not a prophecy. The doors opened on the lobby, and the sudden rush of sound and movement was like a physical blow. The building was in the midst of a silent, high-stakes invasion. Men and women in dark windbreakers with yellow lettering were streaming through the revolving doors, their faces set in the grim, bureaucratic determination of those about to dismantle an empire. I saw the flash of badges, the heavy cases of equipment, and the sharp, tactical movements of agents who knew exactly where they were going. I stepped out of the elevator and walked directly through the center of the chaos, a ghost passing through a storm. None of them looked at me. To them, I was just another corporate executive leaving for the day, perhaps a bit more composed than the secretaries and junior analysts who were huddled in the corners, whispering in hushed, panicked tones. I was invisible, a talent I had spent a decade perfecting. But for the first time, my invisibility didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like freedom. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the biting chill of the autumn air hitting my face with a sharpness that made me gasp. The city was alive, indifferent to the collapse of the Titan in the tower behind me. Taxis honked, steam billowed from subway grates, and people hurried past me with their collars turned up against the wind, each of them buried in the small, frantic dramas of their own lives. I started to walk, my heels clicking a steady, grounded rhythm on the concrete. I didn't head toward the black car I'd had waiting for me 3 blocks away. I didn't head toward the airport or the various safe houses I had established across the continent. I just walked. I thought about the money. In the accounts I had reclaimed, the ones Marcus and Julian had stolen from me, plus the interest I'd skimmed from their own illicit gains over the years, there was enough to buy a dozen lives. I could retreat to a villa in Tuscany, a penthouse in Tokyo, or a quiet ranch in the mountains where I would never have to see another human being again. But as I crossed the street, weaving through the late afternoon traffic, the thought of the money felt strangely heavy, like a suit of armor I no longer needed to wear. It was a resource, a tool for survival, but it wasn't the prize. The prize was the weight in my chest that had finally, mercifully, gone still. I found myself in a small, unremarkable park a few blocks south. It was a patch of wilted grass and iron benches squeezed between two towering glass monoliths. I sat down on a bench that was peeling gray paint, my hands resting on my knees. I looked at my fingers. They were steady. No tremors, no tension. I remembered how they had looked 12 years ago, bloodied and broken, fumbling in the dirt as I crawled away from the wreckage of the car they had run off the road. I remembered the smell of gasoline and the sound of Julian's laughter echoing in the dark. For a long time, I thought that version of me, the woman who loved, who trusted, who built things with her hands, was dead, replaced by the cold, tectonic force of Alina Vance. But sitting there, watching a pigeon peck at a discarded crust of bread, I realized that Alina Vance was the one who had died in that office today. She was the construct, the weapon I had forged in the fires of my own destruction. And the woman who remained wasn't the broken girl from the wreckage either. She was someone new, someone forged from the scars, yes, but not defined by them. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter, a habit I'd picked up during the years of waiting, a way to keep my hands busy. I flicked it open, watched the small, dancing flame for a second, and then snapped it shut. I dropped it into the trash can beside the bench. The sun began to dip behind the skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the park. The air grew colder, but I didn't move. I felt grounded, rooted to the earth in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. The cruelty they had inflicted on me had been meant to erase me, to turn me into a cautionary tale of what happens when you stand in the way of men like them. They thought I'd never recover. They thought the trauma would be a cage I'd never escape. And in a way, they were right. I didn't recover the life I had. I didn't go back to being the person I was. That woman is gone, and I don't mourn her anymore. What I found instead was a terrifying, beautiful clarity. I looked up at the towering office building I had just left, its glass skin reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Somewhere up there, Marcus was being led out in handcuffs. Somewhere else, Julian was realizing that his political career was dissolving into a puddle of scandal and litigation. Their world was ending in fire and noise. Mine was beginning in the quiet. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my suit. I felt the strength in my legs, the air in my lungs, and the hard one piece in my mind. I didn't need a destination. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't running toward a goal or away from a nightmare. I was just existing. I turned away from the towers, away from the wreckage of the past, and started walking toward the subway. I had no idea where I was going to sleep tonight or what name I would use tomorrow, and for the first time in my life, that didn't frighten me. The scars were still there, etched into my skin and my memory, but they were no longer a map of my pain. They were the architecture of my survival. I was a woman who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unburnt, but tempered. And as I disappeared into the crowd, a single anonymous figure among millions, I knew that I was finally, irrevocably whole.